So welcome everybody to the November Kanban Coaching Exchange. As always, it's fantastic to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces, especially from across the world. You know, what I love about this now is we are truly a global Kanban Coaching Exchange community, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So I've got an absolute blinder for you tonight. We've got the Ian Carroll joining us all the way from Warrington. I've known Ian a few years now, and he's been in the Kanban community for a very, very long time. In fact, in 2015, Ian was actually awarded the prestigious Brickle Key Award, which sadly has now been discontinued, for his contributions to the Kanban community around IT support, but also around the articles and all of the case studies that he's done. So if there's an industry out there, I was looking for SAP the other day, Ian is the man. He's probably got some example from where he's worked on. He's got his own company, become a Kanban trainer. Generally, he's the real deal. He's an all-rounder with fantastic Kanban knowledge, and I'm looking forward to him telling us all about dependencies tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ian. Take it away, Ian.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for having me tonight. So I'm going to just jump straight in there. I think you've got enough about my bio now. So we're going to be talking tonight about 17 dependency management hacks to improve flow efficiency. If you want to reach out to me, you can do. There's my Twitter handle, and more than happy to connect on LinkedIn. Right, so where this talk has kind of evolved from was I've been kind of building this slide deck for many years now, probably 8-9 years, as we've kind of worked through different teams and had different experiences, hit many challenges around dependency management, particularly when you're working with teams who are operating at scale. You kind of just discover these little tricks and tips, and we've just been building the slide deck up. So we've knocked it into shape a little bit now, and we're kind of ready to kind of take you through some of the learnings here. Now, what we're not going to do is just say this is how you should manage dependencies. What we're going to do is present a set of tips and different techniques, so you can maybe use it as a more of a toolkit going forwards. Okay. I'm also really keen to hear from other people on their experiences as well. So hopefully you'll find it useful tonight. I'm going to share it with you, and it'd be great if you're happy to share things back with me as well, and we can build up this body of knowledge around dependency management. But like anything, we just need to cover a couple of base concepts first, because we've got quite an audience tonight, probably a mixture of all abilities, different levels. So I just want to make sure that when I'm talking, number one, people know what the hell I'm talking about. I sometimes struggle with that myself, understanding. So hopefully you can just bear with me. Right, so base concepts. We're going to talk first about a metric called cycle time. Now, this won't be a new metric to probably a lot of you, but for those of you who have never come across it before, we have this concept within Kanban, which is when work passes a particular point, and in other words, it comes out your backlog and it's selected and people start working on it, you can kind of get a stopwatch, start the stopwatch, and that's what we call the commitment point. So as soon as work starts, we start the timer, we let it continue to run until we get to our definition of done. And again, I'm not going to get into definitions of done, but it's at some point where we consider it's done, it's ready. Preferably, that would be a live environment where our end users are reaping the benefit of that feature or that story that's just been delivered. So we measure that for every single work item going across the board. And then at some point, we should get a data set out the other end, which may be visualized as a run chart. So for example, here, we've got work items that some take 11 days, this one took 12, 7. We can use standard deviation to give us the expected predictable boundaries of this particular data set. So you may be able to say that this team delivers predictably between 6 and say 14 days. Okay. Now, of course, we do have an outlier. Something took 19 days. So the number one question the team should be asking about that is, why did that take 19 days when everything else should take between 6 and 14 days? Okay. So that's one way of looking at cycle time and one way of visualizing it. The next one, and we're going to be talking about this quite a bit in this talk, is cycle time displayed or rendered as a distribution. So what we can see here is a histogram where 85% of the work items in this data set get delivered in 15 days or less. All right, so bear that in mind. The 95th percentile is 23. And some of the terminology we're going to be using now is about trimming the tail. So look at the tail on this data set. It's not too bad. Seeing really pretty horrendous tails in some teams are going up to hundreds of days. But essentially, one of the things we're going to talk about is trimming that tail back and trying to become more predictable as a team. Okay. So what are the things that could maybe result in a long tail? Well, let's explore a few of those things. By the way, I failed to mention at the beginning, I'm going to rip through these slides as quick as I can, but obviously make sure you get all the information you need. And at the end, maybe we'll get the questions at the end. Feel free, though, as we go through, to drop your questions in the chat window, and we'll maybe tackle them all at the end, because I can always nip back through the slides. Okay, so back to this. What could cause that tail to go out there and become a long tail? So some of the common causes, things like poor technical environments or mismatches in environments, multitasking, context switching, technical debt, too many meetings and distractions, everything's a priority, too much work in progress. Any of this sound familiar? Waiting time, misinterpreted requirements, the list goes on. So there's loads of things that could affect your ability to deliver against particular expectations. And that will be kind of visible in our cycle time in the way we plot data. Now, for this talk, we're going to focus on dependencies. What are the things that we can do to help us to reduce the impact of these delays on our end-to-end flow? Okay. So that's the first concept, cycle time. The second part of this is there's a great body of knowledge, which is a paper pulled together in 2012 by Strode and Huff. And they provided a bit of language and a definition of taxonomy of Agile software project dependencies. So it's really well worth having a look at that. We're not going to go into all of that today. But again, I like the way it kind of calls out the different types of dependencies. So, for example, how many times have you been asked by a project manager or somebody else to, can we have a conversation about dependencies? Or we need to go and do some planning around dependencies. Well, my automatic question now back to them is, what do you mean by dependencies? What type of dependencies are we talking about? So it's really important that we kind of focus on the language of dependency management as well. And so everyone really understands how we go about things. And some of the things that really came out of this paper for me was things like when you've got a dependency on a requirement, you may have your known unknowns, and you may have unknown unknowns. So again, making sure that we're really looking at each of the different dependency types and being able to come back then and really kind of look at that. So things like expertise, we're all a lot of people operate in silos, and then how do we get that expertise from that person in another department at the right time, exactly at the point where we need it. Okay. How's my audio, Helen?
All great, Ian. All great.
Good. Okay. Sorry, I've been having audio problems today. Okay. So moving on then. The other concepts that I'd like us to just think about now is the nature of teams and how we organize our teams. We risk slipping down into a deep conversation about Conway's law at this point. but I'd like to just sort of explain it in kind of the way my brain operates, which is hopefully in a simple way. So I want you to imagine we've got a feature team, and it's cross-functional. Oh, it's very scrummy, this one. We've got scrum masters, product owners, devs, we've got service reliability engineers, and testers, etc. Now, that's typically what a lot of people think about a team. It's just cross-functional. It's got all the skills you need to deliver value. But actually, when you're operating at scale, or maybe some of the situations that you find yourselves in, maybe we can't deliver everything within the team. Maybe we have to rely on component teams. So I worked in an organization recently, and we're going to paint the picture of what that organization kind of looks like. So they even had firmware teams that we had to ship out firmware updates. They had a legacy mainframe teams that we had to draw upon to get work done. I spelled that wrong, but Microsoft Dynamics. So from a kind of that whole CRM piece, getting a single view of the customer. SAP. So we've been doing a lot of work with SAP teams recently. And the feature team was a kind of Microsoft stack sort of development team. But still, we need to integrate. We need to get information flowing around the organization. And of course, a lot of this all pulled together with an API. Now, we could talk all day about, oh well, you shouldn't really design your organization like that, or you shouldn't you shouldn't have teams structured in that way. But the reality is, this is how they're structured. They've got to this point over many years of evolution and growth within the business. So it's about where they are now, being able to tackle that. We also then have the concept of shared service teams as well. Things like a legal team, they were involved in a lot of the GDPR work that we were doing. Our user research community and user experience, who are often left out of these teams, and often an afterthought. But again, they're quite a limited commodity or capability within the organization, and they tend to get shared around lots of different teams to work on many different products potentially. Business intelligence is another example of a shared services team. So in other words, they have lots of demand coming into their team. They service that demand. They service various customers or internal customers within the organization. But then occasionally, these feature teams have to draw upon their expertise to fulfill certain requirements. IT operations as well. They often become a pinch point where you're handing off to an IT operations team. And there's also lots of other feature teams as well. So this mantra within the Agile community of, well, let's create cross-functional teams with everyone in it that we need. But can you imagine creating a team with all of these people available all the time when you need them? It becomes actually a very, very difficult kind of problem to solve there. So maybe the answer is not to create fully cross-functional teams with everybody in it. Maybe there's other ways that we can find to enable people to be available just in time, as and when we need them, from wherever they are in the organization. Okay. So think about the concepts in teams. So we've got cycle time and that lead and that cycle time distribution, and looking for variation in our cycle time. We've now got teams and how the nature of teams and how things all plug together within organizations. And don't forget, on here, we're not even included third parties, people from outside of the organization as well. So things can become very, very complex very quickly. All right. The next concept is upstream versus downstream dependencies. And we're going to use some of this language when we're describing some of the techniques we use to manage flow across the organization. So I'd like you to just think about this idea that we have a feature team who gets blocked. They may use a blocker sticker on their board. to visualize that they're now blocked. They're waiting for another team. They hand off to, say, a shared service team. That shared service team starts doing some work. They also get blocked because they need a component team. The component team works, well, it sits in their backlog for however long. They deliver the requirement to basically unblock and enable the upstream team. They then do the same. They complete their piece of work. And finally, it then gets to the very top level so they can then flow their feature across the board. So the concept here is teams who are basically down to the right there are downstream teams, and the ones above there are upstream teams. Now, the reason I'm kind of spelling that out is because there's a few things, important things you need to think about when we're talking about these teams. Bear with me. Is that downstream teams can very rarely see the dependencies from upstream. It's all just demand that arrives within their team. Okay. So actually, it's really important that the furthest upstream team owns the entire dependency chain, and they're also very responsible for managing that down the chain as well, and making sure that actually, these dependencies are being kind of serviced. All right. Look at the cycle time distribution on each of the downstream teams as well. So we talked about the importance of cycle time. Now, that team in the middle, if they've got a very long tail, in other words, if they're very unpredictable, then there's going to be a really big impact. So there's a lot of risk for the upstream team. I just realized I can waft my mouse pointer. There we go. So this team, very unpredictable. And so what you want is these tails to be as short as possible in any downstream team, because what we're then doing is we get in an element of predictability, and we can kind of link that together. And we'll show you in a minute how we kind of do that. So the reality is these dependencies everywhere. People, talk about don't manage dependencies, break the dependencies. What if you've got work sat in your backlog, which has got to go through a technical design authority? What if we then got an API team who hand off to other teams down in the downstream of the chain? Maybe we've got a legal department who have to then get involved and sign certain things off. IT operations when we put things into live. So again, you could have many layers of handoffs going down the stream. But the key thing here is that dependencies really are everywhere. And actually, we talk a lot in the Kanban community about, an organization is a network of interdependent services. So don't try to merge them all into one big blob of capability. So the two high-level approaches then to managing dependencies, I guess you got two options. You can break the dependency. It's often really hard to do that. There's often lots of politics involved. If we're talking about teams who have been established for a long time and we're going to try and break those teams up to reorganize, Conway's law comes in then, particularly when you've got monolithic architectures that you may be dealing with. You may have to re-platform. That can take many years to do. Legacy technology, maybe other things that are preventing you from doing that. And then just all of the basic things like people empire building, looking after their part of the organization. So why would they want to kind of carve it up and start to lose that? But again, it can be quite a gnarly area to start breaking the dependencies. But you can do it, and we'll show you some of the techniques there. So the other thing you can do is actually reduce the impact the dependency has on your flow. So we're going to go through the next section now, and we're going to start looking at some of these actual practices. So here we go, 17 dependency management practices. I use the word hacks, it's a bit of clickbait, isn't it? It's like, ooh, That sounds like it might be interesting. So yeah, we use that word. Now, the other thing to say, these are in no particular order. I'm just going to throw them out there, and I don't prefer one over the other. There's not really any of them which are used more than others. It's just a collection of different practices that we'll take you through. Right, here we go. Number one. Oh dear, a Gantt chart. Have I really just put a Gantt chart in a presentation at the Kanban Coaching Exchange? Well, yes. So this is a very common technique that we see. I wouldn't waste your time doing it. There's too many meetings associated with this. You know, the normal format to producing a kind of dependency chart, something like this, is somebody will go and interview lots of people, get estimates from different departments, stack them all up in a pretty kind of Gantt chart, and then hope that everything comes together. Now, if anyone's familiar with the gambling or betting world, the odds of this actually being success is the same as like a 7-fold accumulator. So every bet has to come off for you to be able to get that. It's highly unpredictable. I said too much maintenance, and it's possibly the worst approach you could take. But it's interesting. This is very common. We see this everywhere. The next one, number 2, this was popularized by SAFe. And the idea here is that we can, well, I guess the first thing is we can anticipate all our dependencies up front. That's probably a bit unfair. Actually, we can maybe visualize everything we know at the time at which we can see that. We use our wool on a wall. We stick all out. We run the kind of lines of wool around the board, and we kind of map out all our different dependencies. So this is, I've seen so many of these boards in organizations, and normally you kind of see it one day and then you go back a few days later and it looks the same. You go back a few weeks later, it's still the same. And it turns out they're quite hideous to keep up to date, because as we know, people who are doing iterations or sprint-based delivery, things tend to roll over to the next sprint or get carried over. So of course there's some poor, what's it called, release train engineer or some other kind of PI planning person who has the horrible task of keeping this board up to date, and things just roll and roll. It's like a rolling bow wave across the board as things change, and also as things emerge as well. But you know what? Visualization is great, right? And this is about engaging all the teams who are involved to bring them together to help to build this. So yeah, not as bad as the previous one, but again, it's got its limitations, like all of these have. Now, number 3, visualize blockers and cluster. So this is such a simple thing, and we teach it on all kind of Kanban courses. This idea that if we've got blockers, we visualize them, but more importantly, we manage them as well. We pretty much everything that we work on may get blocked at some point on its journey. So again, what we used to do was put a blocker sticker on it pre-COVID, when we had a nice physical board that we could stick things on. And then when we've unblocked it, we used to rip it up, the blocker sticker, say, yep, that's great, throw it in the bin. And so what we decided to start doing was collect these blocker stickers, put them in an envelope at the end of the board. And then every couple of weeks, maybe a retrospective, lay out all your blocker stickers on a table, and then start to group them, start to cluster them. Maybe some ways is what we've got on the left here. So we've got sort of, maybe blockers by external blockers and internal blockers. Maybe then we also track how long they've been blocked for. And we can start to say, well, what are the things that really take a long time and they're blocked for many, many weeks or even months in this example? What are the things that are blocked and kind of can be unblocked pretty quickly? So blocker clustering, really effective way. These images were provided courtesy of Klaus Leopold and Troy McGuinness. Thank you very much, guys, for that. The other one on the right here is quite an interesting exercise, which I've only just discovered recently. Following Troy's talk at this very meetup, in fact. And this is the idea that if you were to lay your blockers out on a grid, such as the following, what you can start to do is to look at if something gets blocked, how long does it stay blocked for? So that's in the x-axis here. So that's the delay time. How much waiting time does it introduce? And in the y-axis here, we've got how frequently does it happen? So I guess this is almost getting back to that. There's two approaches, really. Breaking the dependency means the frequency goes down to 0. So it never happens because you've broken the dependency. But then after that, we're really into that game of how do we reduce the impact of the delay and reduce the frequency. Now, one of the things they say also is if you've got things in the top right zone here, then what you don't really want to be doing is trying to go diagonally across the board. And that was a really great little learning point. So if you've got a blocker sticker, you may move it downwards to reduce the frequency of how often it occurs, or you may take it left to reduce the impact of that delay. Okay. And of course, blocker stickers, dependencies, they often go hand in hand, because one of the key ways in which we visualize dependencies is often via blocker stickers. Okay. Oh, in the bottom left here, by the way, I've got whether the strategy is to reduce the impact of the blocker or whether it breaks the dependency. Okay. Number 4. Wow, look at this, reduce systemic WIP. So this is about breaking dependencies. So on the left here, we've got what might be referred to as a portfolio Kanban. So, and what we're doing here, each of those green sticky notes is a project. Ooh, I use the word project, sorry about that. And then each of the teams on the right, that's their local Kanban system or their board. And each of these green tickets explodes out into a whole bunch of tickets within the team as we break the kind of project down. And we've done a lot of work with loads of PMOs, lots of portfolio teams. And what we find is they're obsessed with PIP, projects in progress, or too many PIPs. And one of the things we actively encourage them to do is to reduce the number of projects in progress, because not only does it kind of help anyway with reducing overall work in progress, we found that it really reduces the impact of dependencies as well. So we go from this view to that view, and we get the team more focused. And we've got another talk about portfolio Kanban as well, which is we can go more into how we kind of expand on that. But ultimately, work in progress, too much work in progress, it sucks in dependencies and it amplifies them. So actually, let's reduce the amount of work we have in progress to reduce the dependencies. Next one. So again, we're back to this idea of trimming the tail in terms of cycle time. So this is the idea that we need to monitor and reduce systemic waiting time. So if you think about it, waiting time is the second biggest form of waste on a software project. Obviously, the first biggest waste is doing something that shouldn't be done in the first place. But again, the second, waiting time is everywhere in our systems, in our development processes. So, for example, if you're blocked on a team here on a story, and you're handing off to another team, it goes hands off and it sits in their backlog for what could be an eternity. These are very common figures. So 187 days. That's we've seen lots of examples of this across teams. Actually, once things get onto their board, we've then got to think about waiting time when items are sat in queues. So again, here's an example is 34 days. And the only, of all the tooling that's out there, things like Jira and Azure DevOps and all these common tools, not many of them really track or make it easy to get hold of this kind of waiting time. Okay, Jira's got that little thing where you can turn on the dots on the card, hover over it, tell you how long it's been in that column at the moment. That's about the closest you're going to get to usefulness there. Actually, I think that's the only useful feature in Jira. As you can tell, I'm not a big fan. So again, let's monitor that waiting time end to end, and then find ways to actually then reduce it. Because the first step to tackling the waiting time is understanding what it is. So we need to collect data. So I'd encourage everyone to do that. The next one is kind of almost obvious. This is an idea of being able to self-serve. Why do we hand off to other teams as well? And a lot of the instances where we see teams handing off to other teams is because it's some weird political thing that's going on. When we talk about code base or repository ownership, and really developers, any developer worth the salt can quite often, work on other areas of the code base, not just the ones that have been kind of assigned to their team and their team purpose. So this idea that we should be able to, actually there was a great example the other day where the team were dependent on a DBA from an IT ops team to make every little tiny database change. And it was like, oh, come on, really? Could we maybe put some policies in place and guide rails so the team can self-serve maybe on types of requests? So we really got them to think about that and kicked off a piece of work to enable that self-serve capability within a set of safe guide rails. The next one is systemic swarming. So again, we had this the other day where a developer in team A needed to hand off to to team B to get them to do some work. Now, team B obviously had all their priorities; they were busy, and so what the developer from team A did was simply join team B. And I know this sounds like such a simple, obvious thing to do, but actually, when you start to look at some of the politics that are quite, play quite a big hand in some organizations, it's really about trying to get that swarming and that people moving around so they know where the natural home is. They may be only gone for a few hours, a few days, maybe a week, but ultimately, whoever's leading that team has normally got this idea that, well, if I let them go to that team, I'm going to lose them. I need them on my team. But again, this idea of systemic swarming around the system to other teams wherever is needed, and that's quite an effective an approach there. But again, that's about breaking that dependency. Oh, right. This is obviously often a contentious one. So kind of related to what I was just saying, the last one, this idea that the way some organizations are organized is that different teams own particular repositories, which is fine from an ownership perspective, but when they're actually locked down with permissions so that nobody else can work on it because they want to really feel protective of it, I mean, it does kind of, it frustrates me quite a lot, that. So this idea that actually, why don't we operate like an internal open source model? So if you want to work on another code base, we should be able to do that, but obviously then submit a pull request into that team. That team will then review that. If they're happy with it, they'll approve the pull request and the merge goes ahead. So again, this is an idea, this is a way to reduce the impact of that. Okay, so that's another. Next one. Again, and a similar thing. Quite often, if you're waiting for an API to become available, if you're organizing a kind of tiered structure within teams, then actually just stubbing out placeholders or creating fake objects, then that's another way that enables developers to then continue maybe on a kind of feature-rich approach. Before, obviously, there's a bit of comeback there. You then got to come back and plug it in and integrate it properly. But again, it may enable you to get things moving across your board and enable you to get feedback on those features and iterate accordingly whilst you're still waiting for the underpinning infrastructure to be available. Next one. This is a technique we use at a price comparison website, should we say. And if you imagine, if you go to get car insurance in one of these price comparison websites, you put your details in, you say get quotes, it goes out to 100 and odd insurance providers, They all then come back with their insurance quotes, and you get that up on screen. So this particular team was the team that does the integrations with all the providers. And what they were finding initially when they introduced Kanban was trying to implement limits was a real nightmare, because they'd get something going across the board. It would go into dev. It would then have a blocker sticker on it, because we're now waiting for, I don't know, Churchill Insurance. We're waiting for them to do their bit of integration before it comes back to us. So what do? So we split the column. We create a third-party integration area down below. So as the card comes along, we recognize that it's actually a natural part of their development cycle. So cards, instead of blocking it and taking up kind of spaces in the board above, we'd move it down below. We'd visualize that it was actually with the third party. When we heard back from the third party that it was now available for us to work on, instead of pulling it straight back into dev, we would put it into the analysis done column down below. And then it would then get pulled from that entire column when they've got capacity to work on it. All right. So it's kind of like, if you notice the way it's staggered, the columns, they don't kind of align up really. Dev goes into the dev whip here, and then the done goes backwards. So I guess this is maybe one of the only times in Kanban when you would be safe to see a card go backwards on the board almost. Normally if something goes backwards, you treat that as a signal that there's maybe something we need to look at here, something not quite right. So, but again, in this instance, it's actually part of the flow. Okay. And that was actually repeated across the board as well, because it wasn't just in dev. We had to have this feedback loop within testing, etc. Right. Number 11. This is the idea that when you pull something into dev and you start working on it, at that point you go, oh no, we've got a dependency. Ooh, gosh, put a blocker sticker on it. Let's escalate. Let's do all the things we need to do. And actually, when you think with hindsight, maybe we would have known that we had a dependency. So again, what we can start to do is to embellish our cards when they sat in the backlog with blocker stickers or dependency flags of some sort. So in this example here, we're just using a kind of tick box to say, well, for this card, we know we're going to need the CRM team, the SAP team, and we're going to need a load of firewalls, rules changing. So again, making sure we've ticked those boxes before we then pull it in and start work on it. Next one, manage both ends of the dependency. Remember, the upstream team is ultimately responsible for all the dependency chain downstream. So pretty much every week when I'm coaching teams, we come across this problem. I had one yesterday where somebody said, we've got a dependency, we're blocked, we're waiting for team B. And of course, this is all in Azure DevOps. We can share the screen, we can have a look at that. I say, okay, well, go and show me on team B. You will show me the piece of work on their board. And we go over to team B and there's no sign of any work. So where's your request? Well, I sent an email. I sent an instant messenger on Teams to say we need this piece of work doing. Yeah, but where is it on their board? So again, this idea that you have to go downstream, look at their board, and actually add the card on there. All right, to make sure that it's there, and also then attend their replenishment meetings. Go to their daily stand-ups if you're doing daily stand-ups, and really push for that card to be moved across the board. Right, here's another one, dependency maps. I've seen these used at Scrum of Scrums quite a lot. This idea that we're just going to map them out on a grid, and we're going to say color code them, say how urgent. This is all right, can kind of work in a lot of instances. But again, I think that was pretty self-explanatory, that one. Obviously, you need everyone at the meeting. And then how frequently you do it, well, it's up to you. If something's urgent, less than one day, I'd hope you wouldn't be kind of waiting for the next meeting in 2 days' time. Next one, use explicit policies to expedite. So this works really well when you've got feature teams who are dependent on other feature teams. I've seen this quite often because this becomes a organizational wide policy. And notice that the row in the backlog here in the demand is an expedite. It doesn't go all the way across the board. This is a bit like the fast track at Disneyland or the kind of theme parks. If you've got a fast track pass, it means you can get straight to the front of the queue. Doesn't mean to say you actually then expedite across the board, but it means then you're next in the priority list. So the idea here is that any upstream dependency is assumed to be high priority if you're a downstream receiver of that. So we should automatically expedite them. Be warned though, don't introduce this on component teams or shared service team boards, because actually they have many masters. So they're always they're always in some sort of dependency chain. So it's unfair for them to just expedite everything because, well, it's just a mess then, isn't it? Next one, re-architect. This is this idea of breaking the dependency. So let's just re-platform. Let's change it. I've worked with some organizations who have basically spent 2 to 3 years breaking up their architecture and designing their organization to align to that architecture in terms of how they grow their teams, what teams are responsible for what parts of the architecture. But again, this takes a lot of time, a lot of investment, and a lot of a lot of will as well. The other one is this idea that we've got a shared environment. So again, dependencies are not just people or sequencing of work. You may just have this idea that everyone's using the same testing environment. And if you want to test something and deploy to that environment, you take a ticket, join the queue, wait for that environment to become available. Of course, that creates waiting time. And this is where people have this false sense of security around, well, we're going to book that in advance. We're going to book it for 3 months' time, and the development team, you must get everything done by that kind of time period. Once it's there, of course, they're never ready in time. So one of the ideas here is just use cloud. Let's start scaling up. But again, let's have dedicated environments for teams so they can work on that themselves as and when they want to. But of course, it takes budget, technical constraints, all sorts of potential gotchas there. And then finally, this idea of why when teams come to merge code, particularly on these monolithic code bases, it's quite hard. We get into all sorts of branches and feature branches and branches of branches, and if we can get to a trunk-based development, then that may reduce the impact that we have on trying to get features out the door. So again, decouple code release from feature enablement. So here we are. I'm going to leave some time for questions. So the key takeaways really is visualize everything. Now, of course, we're all electronic these days. The current tooling doesn't really help. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about your Jiras of the world and the Azure DevOps. They're awful for doing this kind of visualization and trying to track and embellish our kind of stories as they're moving across the board. And, even the board designs, creating better board designs. I've done some work with Kanban recently, looking at their kind of board editor, and you can start to implement some of these things that we've spoken about. I'm not promoting that, by the way. It's just one of the good experiences of using electronic tooling. But again, we start by visualizing the problem. The next thing is we measure. Let's start collecting data, particularly around cycle time and systemic cycle time. Remember, we always measure end to end, and if our end to end incorporates a whole bunch of interlinked or interdependent services, well, then we need to find ways of measuring that. And once we've got some data, we can then start to look at ways of optimizing to reduce the impacts of those those dependencies on our flow. Okay, I think we've got 10, 15 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. Let's give him a round of applause before we go into questions. Woo. There we go. I could hear more claps. Okay, so who's got some questions for Ian?
Unmute button so schnell, so fast.
I have two from the chat. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ulrich.
All right. Thanks, Ian. Lots of good stuff. Very interesting, and it's clear you've done this before. I was wondering. I was reading the preview of the KMM 1.2 after the conference, and there's quite an extended treatment there on dynamic reservation systems. Have you by chance had a chance to look at that, or maybe even try it out in practice? Because it seems very interesting, but also perhaps a little ambitious.
Yeah, I'm starting to. I am going to start. No, but I've not properly got into that, to be fair. And I think really it goes back to this idea of. I think when we saw let's have a look. This idea on that one there, I think this kind of lends itself into enabling that dynamic reservation system, because you're kind of reserving capacity, or you're changing the way work is prioritized at the point where you're selecting. So it's at that replenishment point. But again, I think it's got its limitations. I think when you've got component or shared service teams who are basically just, servicing so much demand, being able to actually do that is obviously quite tricky. So yeah, no, definitely I'm going to be looking a bit more into that area, but thanks for that.
Thanks.
Ian, hi there.
Hi there.
Yeah, great presentation, by the way. Now that you're on this slide, the explicit policies to expedite, would you also sort of have an SLA in terms of expedite and also categorize each requirement? So have it, for example, classes or services. So for example, a feature could be one, I don't know, documentation being updated, that kind of stuff. And then you can set expectations based on those SLAs and what's expected for each category.
Yeah, I think this is where you're right. Your classes of service definitely come in here.
Yeah.
Now, whether you would assign a class of service to the inbound dependencies there, I'm not sure, because once it's on the board, it'll take as long as it takes. And I guess you could maybe then switch up the class of service to an expedite if you really need to. But again, this is where the conversations really get quite interesting with the stakeholders who are involved with the demand on this board. Because what if there's other priorities going through? We all see that all the time. Yeah. There's lots of competing priorities across organizations. So again, collect the data. If you can change the class of service and give it an upgrade once it's on the board, maybe. Yeah. Don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it's normally conversations and really discussions about which classes or services what. So you're right in that. But setting those expectations can also help, I think.
Yeah, and also once if something arrives in this inbound queue, basically, it's not a fait accompli. There's still a discussion that goes around that, because who's to say people are not going to try it on and try and
exactly.
So you just don't kind of stick things in there and go, yeah, there you go, get it delivered. You have to justify why it's a real dependency and why it's urgent.
I have a question that was posted earlier from Haroon, which was, what would be a recommendation to visualize blockers and impediments at scale remotely with 15/18 teams? Do you have any tools that do this?
Well, in what way do you want to visualize the dependencies? I think you've seen here there's lots of different ways of doing that, whether it's in a kind of a program board, like in the SAFe kind of model, or whether it's visualizing blockers in terms of things in the backlog, dependency maps where you've got each of your teams. There's a lot of of different ways of visualizing. What I have noticed is that things like Jira, let's talk about that, is you can link cards. You can say this is a dependency of that card, But again, I'm really keen to find some good plugins which would help to visualize that. So I'd throw it out to the audience. Has anybody got any good plugins for any of these tools? I think things like Kanbanize and Swift Kanban, they're the two ones that I'm really looking hard at the moment. They're the closest to it in getting us some good visualization. But again, yeah, it's difficult.
Swift Kanban.
Thank you, Ian. Appreciate that.
Doing some API calls and things, which might help matters. I've only fairly recently got a license for it, so can't give you much hard evidence in about usage because I'm only just starting to create boards and use it in anger. But I think as they expand the APIs, that could touch on that area too.
And what was that, Matt?
Swift Kanban.
Yeah.
I've just recently got a license for that, so just starting to create some boards now. I think probably going to be early January before I get a chance to do it on a project. But I'm sure that I've read recently they're starting to expand and look at now APIs for Kanban boards. So from the visualization point, that could help out greatly.
Yeah, I'm also because also I've got a client who has multiple work management systems as well, not just Jira, or they've got Jira, they've got Azure DevOps, they've got and there's dependencies across all of these different teams. Even the SAP teams have got their own. I don't know. I think it's some sort of homegrown system. But yeah, I think the interoperability between these systems is key as well to be able to get that view. But I'll tell you what, if anyone develops plugins for that, I think I'd be one of your first customers.
I have another one from Dave. Fixing much of this requires rapid escalation to someone with the power to change the org structure. How do you deal with this in your engagements?
So, well, yeah, I think that's where a lot of the break dependency ones come in. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time. But again, trying to use data where we can, try and visualize, take them through. And don't expect to solve it overnight as well, because there's so many other forces at play, particularly around politics across teams and the way teams are structured. So again, we just share the data. I've just seen one from Bob. Right, I'll do this. A question from Bob: how does organizational psychotherapy play into reducing managing dependencies? Don't know, Bob. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you've raised the point, various points in this evening's presentation and in answering these questions about the role of politics and the advantages of having policies, which are just kind of two aspects of getting people in an organization to talk to each other about these kinds of things. And from my perspective, if you provide the opportunity to broach those kinds of conversations, then the kind of impacts that dependency failures, if you like, have, you can see reduced just through dialogue and conversation and collaboration at the conceptual level rather than at any kind of technical or tool level.
Yeah, because what is the perfect organizational design anyway? Doesn't exist, surely. We just keep evolving. But again, I think organizations who are not able to shift and evolve quickly because of all of those conversational and political blockers, you're absolutely right, Bob. It's about how do we engage them? How do we make them feel safe to experiment with organizational design as well? That's quite a tricky one.
Yeah, and even more fundamental than that, how do we raise the profile of dependencies as an issue?
Well, it's interesting that they just think it's a project manager's problem to solve, when actually this is a team level problem and an organizational problem.
Yeah.
I had a question that's sort of along those same lines. I was looking at slide or solution number 7, systemic swarming. I'm wondering how you encourage fluidity between teams without breaking the kind of identity of the teams and the metrics that are tied to those individual teams.
Yeah, I guess this comes down to the frequency then, doesn't it? If we've got somebody who keeps nipping off to that team every other day to go, and then you would question, well, should they be part of that team actually? That might be a consideration. I would hope it would be the exception rather than the norm that somebody's swarming systemically. Although I know there are some very advanced kind of thinking, particularly around Mr. Marshall, around this kind of flow chain, and we should just be one big swarming wherever is required. But again, I think that's just a maturity level which is just mind-boggling for most organizations and a million miles away. It's interesting. We always talk about how things should be and what good looks like, and yet the harsh realities of day by day is that it's hard. People are stuck in teams having to walk over to somebody else's team to stick a post-it note on their frigging wall just to get them to do some work which they could actually do themselves. But because of whatever policies and politics are in place, they're not allowed to do that. So again, yeah.
So I reckon one more question from Ian. For Ian, who's got that power killer question to end us up on?
I don't have a power killer question, but maybe we can do 2 because I had one more on my list and I want to
I'm in no rush, by the way. I'm fine.
Okay, good. Go on then, Vlad.
So Candice asked, do you have any techniques to measure wait time or demonstrate why it's important?
Wait time. Yes. So, there's a few things to unpick from that. I think the first thing is measuring wait time is often really difficult. You can get it out the tooling. But are your boards set up appropriately? Can you actually visualize your cues in your work going across your board? The typical sort of work in progress and then a done column, work in progress, done is like a thing. So first of all, have you got the queue set up so you can measure that waiting time? And even if you have, how do you kind of get the data out? Things like we talk about flow efficiency of work time and wait time, and we can come up with a percentage. That's all well and good, but it's hard again to measure the impacts of that. But also coming back to this thing of I think cycle time is quite an easy metric. Being able to visualize when you've got a reduction in the variability of your cycle time, rather than kind of just coming back with a single figure. So again, I think some of the visualizations, things like the cycle time distribution is a great way to show the trimming of the tail, working with teams to do that. To be fair, a lot of the work I do is you just talk to teams, you show them the data. They never realize it was even important or relevant. They start getting inquisitive about it, and then they start to find ways of trimming the tail. So yeah, I think the data is a key there.
Any more questions?
I think Matthew had one to finish us for this evening. Do you want to ask it yourself, Matthew? Maybe
is that
not.
Matt Phillip you're about?
Yeah.
Right, Matt. So did we do this drunk in a pub somewhere? I can't remember.
Sorry, I was eating. Yes, we probably did it both in many cases.
Yeah. Is this the one who's throwing bear mats around here?
I probably have a photo of it, but it's you magically have a note card attached to your nose.
Right. I don't remember that one. I must have been drunk.
Very drunk.
Yeah.
Maybe next time.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ian. We really appreciate you giving up your time for the Kanban Coaching Exchange. Let's give him one final round of applause. We really appreciate that, Ian. Thank you.
And thank you for having me
Nice
as
one.
well.